Good evening, everyone. I hope that you're doing well. Okay, I'm not seeing it on the TV back there. Maybe the TV's not on. Let's see. Should be watching TV anywhere. Hey, there it is. Okay, awesome. Anyway, I hope that you're doing well, having a good week so far, and ready to get into the material this evening. Before we do, though, I'd like to ask Jeff Hunt if he would lead us in a prayer.
Father in heaven, thank you for this day, for the beautiful sunshine we've had today, and for keeping us all safe as we went about our daily business. Thank you for this time we had to come together to study the Word and to sing praises and just be together. Pray that you'll be with those that are not able to be here due to illness, that you'll comfort them and help them to get well. And be with Brian as he has prepared this lesson, that will give us words from your Word that will help us to live our lives on a daily basis. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. The last class, it was more of a doctrinal lesson about the nature of God's ultimate fulfillment of the grand promises he made to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Tonight we're going to pick back up in the narrative in 2 Samuel chapter 8. And what we'll see here is how God begins to fulfill the promises. So on Sunday, we have the ultimate fulfillment of those promises. Here in 2 Samuel 8, we're going to start to see more of the immediate fulfillment of those promises. God kind of goes to work right away on this promise to David. If you could summarize 2 Samuel 8, how would you describe what's going on in this chapter? Okay, yeah, conquest, for sure. I'm choosing the words utter domination by David. I mean, because it is conquest. You're absolutely right, but it is devastating conquest. I mean, it is just widespread conquering of these foreign nations around Israel that have, some of them are relatives, all right, Moab and Ammon and all that, but they've historically been a thorn in the side of Israel. And now David is conquering this territory. And you can see here in the map, this is the color version of the map that's in the book. But you can see here in this green area, in the pink area here, the light pink, was where Israel's official territory was. But David conquered all these areas in green around. And you can see how he really expanded the borders of the kingdom significantly in this chapter. So with that geography in mind, let's start in the chapter. Just look through verse 3 here, 1 through 3. Now after this, it came about that David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. And David took control of the chief city from the hand of the Philistines. He defeated Moab and measured them with the line, making them lie down on the ground. And he measured 2 lines to put to death and 1 full line to keep alive. And the Moabites became servants to David, bringing tribute. Then David defeated Hadadezer and the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to restore his rule at the river. So you see words like defeat and subdue and take control. First he defeats the Philistines, and particularly the chief city, which was probably Gath. And then he goes over and defeats the Moabites. Now, it may be a little surprising that he goes and defeats the Moabites because, remember, back in their history when they were on the journey up northward toward Canaan on the east side of the Jordan River, they had come up against Moab before. And you remember what God told them about Moab and their interactions with them?
Not to fight with them because they were relatives.
Yeah, don't make war with them because they are your relatives. The specific verse is Deuteronomy 2, verse 9. The Lord said to me, "Do not harass Moab, nor provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession, because I have given Ar to the sons of Lot as a possession." I wondered about harmonizing these things, and it seems that the key is here God tells the Israelites not to actually move into their land and, kick them out of their land and take over in that sense, like they did with the rest of the Canaanites. But David isn't really doing that in this chapter. He's not kicking them out and taking over their land like he did with the Canaanites. In fact, he kills 2/3 of them, and he lets 1/3 of them live in their land. All David does is he puts them in subjection to him. He makes sure that they know who is reigning as king. And so the Moabites take tribute and pay homage to the Israelites because of this conquest. Now, another relevant question would be, do you remember what sin the Moabites committed against the Israelites when they came up against them on that northern trek toward Canaan?
They tried to get them to worship idols.
Yeah, remember Balak, the king of Moab, hired Balaam, a false prophet, to curse the Israelites. And of course that did not go well. Every time Balaam tried to curse them, he ended up blessing them, and then eventually they caused them to stumble by getting them involved in idolatry and harlotry with the women. And interestingly, every time Balaam tried to curse them, he not only blessed them, he actually uttered some prophecy. And one of the things Balaam said was this, in Numbers 24:17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob. A scepter shall rise from Israel and shall crush the forehead of Moab and tear down all the sons of Sheth. So God uses Balaam, the prophet hired by the Moabites, to actually bring down a curse on Moab and prophesy that there is a king coming from Israel that will actually crush the forehead of the Moabites. And that's at least partially fulfilled here in 2 Samuel chapter 8. Now in verse 3 you have the Syrians, okay, or the Arameans. I thought I put a circle up there. Yep, okay. The Arameans from Zobah and their king Hadadezer. I'm not sure how to say that exactly. He was defeated, and David, took some of his men and the foot soldiers, 20,000 foot soldiers, and then David hamstrung their horses, all but 100 of them. Now let's talk about this, because I know there are horse lovers, animal lovers a lot in our congregation, and it's a tough verse, right? Let me suggest this. When he hamstrung the horses, I am not sure, I really don't think that he would have cut the tendons on both of their legs. I think then they would have died a slow and agonizing death and just starved to death. They would not have any use whatsoever. I believe he would have just cut the tendon on one of their legs, rendering them useless for speed in battle, to be used, by the enemies. And why would David do this? Is he just, cruel to animals?
God did not want them to be that much into fighting, although he helped them with the fighting they had done.
Okay, yeah, and God was particularly not wanting them to rely on what for their fighting, though?
Themselves.
Yeah, themselves and their horses. One of the warnings against the kings in Deuteronomy chapter 17 is that a king must not amass horses for himself. There are two other things, riches, and what was the third one he's not to amass? Remember? Yeah, wives. Okay, wives. I bring that up on purpose. That's going to come up later with Solomon. But God did not want them relying on horses for their strength in battle, but to rely on him, to trust and have faith in him. And also, it would prevent these horses from being used by their enemies ever again as well. And before we think David is cruel or evil for doing something like this, remember, this didn't really come from David. Back in Joshua 11, verse 6, the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them. He was talking about the northern part of the Canaanites. For tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So this actually is David following a command of the Lord and God's will here, which is why there's a key verse in 2 Samuel 8 and verse 6. At the very end of that verse, it says, "And the Lord helped David wherever he went." And that verse, that same thing is repeated in verse 14. What you see in this chapter is what it looks like for God to build David a house and a kingdom, at least to start building that house for him and giving him success. Now, what else is David collecting from his victims along the way?
Metals.
Yeah,
Metals, gold.
yeah, gold, silver, bronze. Now, is that because he's amassing riches, like Deuteronomy 17 warns not to?
He's going to
He's
use it
helping
in
his
building.
son to be able
Okay.
to have materials. to do
Yeah, he's going to use those to build God a house. Look in verse 11. Verse 11, King David also dedicated these to the Lord with the silver and gold that he had dedicated from all the nations which he had subdued, from Aram and Moab and the sons of Ammon and the Philistines and Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And later, when David has a conversation with his son Solomon about the plans to build the temple, David says this in 1 Chronicles 22:14, "Now behold, with great pains I have prepared for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver, and bronze and iron beyond weight, for they are in great quantity." Now you kind of can understand what he means by great pains. I mean, he had to do a lot of fighting, and I don't think all of that he collected is just what's mentioned in 2 Samuel 8. It's probably even some additional fighting. That's just an amazing amount of material and wealth that David has collected here. And we're seeing a contrast between David and Solomon, because David here, he does not amass horses, and he does not amass riches, at least for himself. He amasses them for the Lord. But Solomon, he's going to amass horses and riches for himself and like 700 wives. So he's definitely going to break Deuteronomy 17. But David isn't. The Lord is with him. He's very successful. You see this summary verse in verse 15. David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and righteousness for all the people. And this is different from Saul's reign, because under Saul, it seems like he would just kind of fight the nations off, almost like fight them back with a stick, get them scared enough to where they'll leave you alone for a little while, but then they just kind of keep coming back. David didn't do that. He dominated these nations. The text says he placed garrisons in all of these locations. It kind of reminds you of the Roman Empire, doesn't it? Where they spread their influence across the world by putting these little troops in different places to be a constant reminder of who's in charge and who's enforcing things and collecting tribute from all these people, which would have just skyrocketed Israel's economy as well. Any comments or thoughts so far? I still have more to say about this chapter. I just have been talking a long time. So, Bill.
Well, he gathered together all this material. God not allow him to build a place for God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because he had done all of the battles.
Yeah, he had too much blood on his hands, yeah. So it wouldn't be him, it would be Solomon, yeah, once they had all that rest from their enemies. Yeah, Debbie?
I've often thought about, I don't know, because I'm not a historian, but just about what happened when the temple was destroyed and all that great wealth got plundered by other people. Where in the world did it go? Who has it? Who got it? And he worked hard to get that, to build that, and then to see it all just raided and taken it's amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's
Absolutely, and it's tragic. It really is tragic that happened. Yeah, Jack.
Who got the gold were the Romans. When Jesus made the prediction, this is a magnificent structure talking about the temple and saying that the time will come when there will not be one block upon another.
Yeah.
Why in the world would somebody destroy anything that much? What happened, they lit a bunch of fires there, it burned the gold became liquid, gold under those big stones and everything, they had to move it to get the gold. But they got it all.
Yeah. I mean, the enemies would have absolutely plundered and taken all that precious metal. Let me ask this question. Do you all see any parallels between this chapter and what we studied on Sunday about God's ideal king?
God's enemies are utterly destroyed and dominated.
Yeah, absolutely. Remember we read those Psalms like Psalm 110, and God's just He's going to sit at God's right hand until all his enemies are put under his feet, talking about... So I'm basically asking, are there any messianic parallels in this chapter? And I see a lot of them. I see this utter domination of enemies. I see that David is actually ruling the way God intends for his king to rule, because his throne, remember, is established on justice and on righteousness. David really was the closest person to actually live like the king God intended, which is why the prophets so often compared Jesus or the coming Messiah to David, because he was the closest to ever achieve that, which is kind of sad when you think about what happens in chapter 11 with Bathsheba and how far short David falls. But it's still this incredible example of David is ruling with righteousness and justice. All of his enemies are dominated, and God's people are flourishing under his kingship. And all these nations are submitting and bringing their wealth to David. And there are a lot of prophecies about that in the Messianic kingdom. I'll just give you one, but there are several of them. Isaiah 60 and verse 5, "Then you will see and be radiant, and your heart will thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea will be turned to you. The wealth of the nations will come to you." In the New Testament, this is fulfilled not by Jesus physically conquering people and forcing them to pay tribute, right, like in 2 Samuel 8, but by Jesus spiritually conquering people, by people saying, okay, I recognize Jesus as king, I'm repenting, I'm voluntarily coming and giving my entire life and all of my possessions and everything over to Jesus. And in fact, the Gentiles use their wealth to build up the church, to build up God's people. You see that not only in them submitting to Jesus and bringing their whole life and possessions to him, you also see a marvelous fulfillment of that when Paul gathers this great financial contribution from all these Gentiles, and they send it to Jerusalem. They send actual money to the church in Jerusalem. It's just a marvelous picture that would never happen. You just would never have a group of Gentiles collecting money to help a group of Jews in the first century world. That just would not happen. But under Jesus, it did, because those Gentiles had been conquered by Jesus in the sense that they submitted their lives to him, and it changed everything. And it's just a marvelous plan that God had. And what I also want us to see in this chapter is that there are people who just do not want to submit to God's king. They resist him, right? These nations are in an uproar, devising a vain thing, like Psalm 2 talks about. And they band together, they make alliances to try to stop David from ruling over them. But again, in Psalm 2, it's a vain thing. He who sits in the heavens laughs at their futile attempts to stop his anointed one. So I do see some messianic fulfillment in this chapter. Any other comments or questions about this chapter? All right. Psalm 60. Let's look in Psalm 60. We just read 1 Chronicles 22, where David told Solomon, I've gone through great pains to collect all this wealth for the temple. Well, this psalm shows some of those pains that David went through, because the battles were not easy. And this psalm kind of reflects, apparently, when they were fighting against Edom, things were not going well. And so listen to how real and honest the psalmist is with God here. He says, "Oh God, you have rejected us. You have broken us. You have been angry. Oh, restore us. You have made the land quake. You've split it open. Heal its breaches, for it totters. You've made your people experience hardship. You've given us wine to drink that makes us stagger. You've given a banner to those who fear you, that it may be displayed because of the truth, that your beloved may be delivered. Save with your right hand and answer us." We're not given much detail about these circumstances, but based on the title underneath this psalm, It seems like David was up north fighting against the Syrian kings, and then the Edomites came from the south and attacked them. And so David sends Joab back to fight against them, but things were apparently not going well in battle. And so he's just being honest with God about that. Boy, it seems like you've rejected us. It seems like you're just giving us over into the hand. You know, I still trust you. I still trust that you can save us, but what is going on here? Well, then he remembers that God really owns all the nations. Verse 8 is really interesting. God says, Moab is my washbowl, and over Edom I shall throw my shoe. Shout loud, O Philistia, because of me. There's some debate about exactly what these things mean in the context, but a washbowl was used by servants or slaves to clean their master's feet. And so it's a picture of Moab is a washbowl. Like there's just my slave. I just use them for my purposes, essentially. Same thing with I throw my shoe over Edom. It's, you know, the master would come home and, you know, maybe just throw his shoes to his slave to take care of. It's just a menial, very menial task. But God is saying, I own all of these nations. They all belong to me. And in verse 11 and 12, David, these are some of my favorite two verses. Oh, give us help against the adversary, for deliverance by man is in vain. Through God we shall do valiantly, and it is he who will tread down our adversaries. You know, there are times where we may feel like we're losing a spiritual battle, or we don't really understand what's going on, or our enemies, in the sense that maybe people who are non-Christians and they're mocking us, or they're rising up against us in some way, seem to be winning over us. If we have the same trust, through God we shall do valiantly. I don't know if there's another translation, but I love or what other translations say, but I love the New American Standard rendering of we shall do valiantly. You just don't hear that word a lot today, but it's a great word. Any comments or questions about Psalm 60?
Brian, I just keep thinking of Daniel 2:44. Of course, that prophecy wasn't made till later. It was a prophecy that in the days of Rome, that God would set up his kingdom and it would crush and put an end to all the other kingdoms, but it itself would endure forever. God's kingdom would endure forever. And going back to your point about messianic fulfillment, it's not just David, but it's also the kingdom itself that God has established under David is a foreshadowing ultimately of the church. It's a foreshadowing of the kingdom of Christ, which has been established, and it crushes and puts an end to other kingdoms, not in the physical way that David's does, but in the sense that you were speaking of, in the spiritual sense of its reign that cannot be stopped. Yeah. And it's global. And it's a totally different kind of kingdom that can't be put to a stop. Yeah. And so I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And you just see how the kingdom just kind of creeps out into people's hearts. And you have people who are just the absolute worst enemies of the kingdom, like Saul. Not this Saul in 1 Samuel, but Saul of Tarsus in the New Testament. Killing Christians, murdering, hate Jesus. And the kingdom just takes over his heart. Jesus in the gospel, confronts him with his sin, and then he just submits. One of the greatest enemies of Jesus bows the knee, submits, and then starts contributing to spreading the kingdom even further. It really, really is an amazing divine plan that no human being could have ever concocted. It is remarkable. Good thought in it. All right, well, let's talk about 2 Samuel 9. 2 Samuel 8 was about the nature of the kingdom. 2 Samuel 9 is about the nature of the king. And we get to see David's incredible heart of compassion in this chapter. Let's just look at verse 1 to start, and we'll pause after this verse. Then David said, "Is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now, here's my question. Typically, when a new king arises, he's sitting on the throne, and he asks, is there anyone left of the house of the previous king? What is his motivation for that question?
Murder.
So I can kill them. right? Because I cannot leave sons or heirs of the previous dynasty. Otherwise, that's a huge risk. They could rise up against me. They could get some idea that they're going to take vengeance on behalf of their father or their grandfather and try to reclaim this kingdom. Yet, when David asks, he says, so that I may show kindness to him. Let me go back to Jonathan and what he said in this covenant, because Jonathan understood what we were just talking about. This is a covenant. 1 Samuel 20, verse 14 and 15. Jonathan says to David, if I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord, that I may not die? You shall not cut off your loving kindness from my house forever, not even when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. See, Jonathan understood what happens when a new king reigns. And he's asking David, and it seems strange because they were such good friends, but he's asking David, when you rise to power, please do not kill me. Because, he recognizes that would be the smart move politically for David. And it doesn't matter how good of friends you are, you become king and you start to have other concerns for power and the future of your dynasty and all of that. And Jonathan is concerned, well, he doesn't want David to kill him, and he doesn't want David to kill any of his descendants or treat any of his descendants as if they are his enemies. And here in 2 Samuel 9, years have gone by. David's in power. He could have easily changed his mind. He could have easily said, look, that was a long time ago. Situation was different. Find some sort of loophole so he doesn't have to show any kindness. But he doesn't do any of that. And what's remarkable is the kind of person that David shows loving kindness toward, back in our text. Start in verse 3. The king said, is there not yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Ziba, which was Saul's servant, said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in both feet. So the king said to him, where is he? Ziba said to the king, behold, he's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lo-debar. Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, Mephibosheth, and he said, here is your servant. David said to him, do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly. And again he prostrated himself and said, what is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me? This descendant of Jonathan is a cripple. He is not able to be independent. He's not someone that can really do anything for David. This isn't somebody who's going to be a servant. So it's just great advantage to have Mephibosheth around, because he's going to do all kinds of favors for you and serve you, and he's going to join your army. No, none of that. But David is not doing any of this for what he can get from Mephibosheth. It's all about what he can give for the sake of that covenant that he made with his father Jonathan. If you imagine, if you're Mephibosheth, if you get a message from the king saying, hey, we need to talk, I'd be absolutely terrified. And I bet he was, which is, probably why the first thing out of David's mouth to Mephibosheth is, do not be afraid. Because he would have thought he would be worthy of death. He should die. And I would also add part of the fear. You remember, what was the occasion that caused Mephibosheth to be lame in his feet, to be crippled? You remember?
His nurse was carrying him.
Yeah, his nurse, or maybe we would view it as a nanny, right? She's carrying him as a child. And why is she in a hurry? Why is she running with this child? You remember?
They killed Jonathan.
Yeah, she heard the news that Jonathan and Saul were dead. So she's running probably in fear of her life, especially of this new king. I know it wasn't David that killed Saul and Jonathan, but still she's thinking, look, this is the end of this dynasty. We need to get out of here. We need to get somewhere safe. And Mephibosheth had been living in Lo-debar, which is kind of a bit of a wilderness area, probably in safety, and yet the king finds him, calls him into his court. Got to stand before the king. Falls on his face before him. He's humble. He says, do not fear. And then David proceeds to give Mephibosheth all the land that belonged to Saul in Gibeah. And, at first you might think, well, what good is having land if you're a cripple? Well, then he turns to Saul's servant, Ziba, and he says, you know what you're going to do? You're going to take your 15 sons. He had 15 sons. Your 20 servants. And you're going to go cultivate that land for Mephibosheth. And make sure that Mephibosheth is taken care of forever. And then he says, Mephibosheth, you can have a seat at my table anytime you want. It really, really is something that should not be done among kings. I mean, just would not be done. We read this and we're just so divorced from that culture and ancient Near Eastern kingship. And for somebody to do something like this for someone like that is just unheard of. But it shows this incredible heart of David, and such a touching verse. At the very end of verse 11, it says, so Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Took him in, treated him like a son. He didn't care. David didn't care what the royal court would think when they came in and saw a cripple eating at his table. He didn't care how undignified maybe people would think that he was, or that, the king really should only be hanging out with the well-to-do and those that can court him some political favor. David doesn't care about any of that. He not only protects Mephibosheth, he provides for him, and then he elevates him to a position of honor in the palace, treating him like one of his sons. He gives him protection, provision, and position. It's really, really amazing. And, you really just, you can't help but ask this question: who are we in this story? When you're thinking about messianic undertones in the story, which you just can't escape the messianic undertones in this story. We are Mephibosheth. Spiritually, we were crippled and helpless. Not only were we helpless spiritually, we were enemies of God. And we should have been killed. And because of God's love and faithfulness to his covenant, he sends Jesus to die for us, even while we were enemies, even while we were helpless, Romans chapter 5. And he protected us, he provides for us, and he exalts us to the position of son, getting to eat regularly at the king's table. Any comments or thoughts on this chapter?
I think it shows a deep love that David had for Jonathan. And I think that we as Christians need to find that kind of love for each other.
Yeah, great point. This shows the deep love he had for Jonathan. And as Christians, we need to develop that kind of deep love for one another. That we keep our word to one another. We look out for each other. We help each other. Vanessa?
Just that David said in verse 3 that he wanted to show God's kindness. Yes, he's doing this, but he's not just taking credit for it. He knows where he's at. He knows what he's facing. It's just another insight of his humility. And he's not afraid to say that to others and make him, it's not going to degrade him at all. This is God's kindness.
Yeah.
This is his example.
Great point. I mean, wasn't David protected by God, provided for by God, exalted to a position of king by God? Absolutely. Now he's looking to do that for someone else who is equally undeserving. Yeah. Carol, do you have something?
It's another reflection of the future king who bowed his knee, bended his knee, and washed his disciples' feet. Another unheard of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good point. And, we all need to have the attitude of Mephibosheth, right? Because he doesn't say, that's right, you give me a place because, I'm the king's son. No, he doesn't, or I'm Saul's grandson. No, he says, I'm just a dead dog. How could you show me this kind of kindness? You have that same humility and appreciation for what God has done for us. And like David, we need to look out for those who are afflicted, who can't necessarily help themselves as much as they would like, and we need to reach out to them and not only help each other or help the rich or those that can do things for us in return, but help those selflessly that cannot do anything for us in return. My better book hit. 2 Samuel chapter 10. This chapter explains how the wars started with the Syrians. Back in chapter 8, it says David went to war with the Syrian king Hadadezer. This explains the origins of that. So after David shows his kindness back home in Jerusalem, now he reaches out. He wants to share that kindness with others, even his relatives, the Ammonites. He hears that Nahash, their king, has died, so he sends servants to comfort Hanun, his son, in his mourning. But the servants turn against David and they say, look, he's not here to help. These men are just here to spy out the land. David is plotting to destroy us. And so Hanun takes David's servants and utterly humiliates them. He cuts off their beards and he cuts off their garments in the middle of their waist as far as their hips, so they have to walk back naked. And when David finds out, he's not happy. Okay, and when the Ammonites find out that David is angry about this, they hire the Syrians to help them. And this is kind of the map of what David's enemies look like right now, what he's up against from all these different areas. So David sends Joab and his mighty men down here to fight against Ammon. Well, when he does that, now he's flanked because the Ammonites are down here in the south and all the Syrians have kind of joined forces up here and they're coming downward from the north. So Joab splits the armies up. He tells Abishai, his brother, to go fight in the south against Ammon, and he'll go fight up in the north. And then he says something really amazing, which, out of the mouth of Joab is remarkable. In chapter 10, verse 11, chapter 10, verse 11, he said, if the Arameans are too strong for me, then you shall help me. But if the sons of Ammon are too strong for you, then I will come to help you. Be strong, and let us show ourselves courageous for the sake of our people and for the cities of our God. And may the Lord do what is good in his sight. Joab isn't really a guy you would consider a righteous man, but he says something pretty righteous here. And he has a good plan to use teamwork. And the Syrians, they're driven back. And after they retreat, the Ammonites saw that, and the Ammonites retreat. And David leaves the Ammonites alone for now. And he goes up and fights the Syrians. Well, the Syrians aren't ready to concede defeat, so they actually hire some people from up here on the wood paneling to come down and help them fight against David. But that doesn't work either, because as 2 Samuel 8 pointed out, David makes quick work of them. And then later he goes and fights and destroys the Ammonites. It's actually pretty rough, but in chapter 12, in verse 31, it says, chapter 12, verse 31, this is where the Ammonite victory picks up. And it says, he also brought out the people who were in it and set them under Saul's sharp iron instruments and iron axes and made them pass through brick kiln. And thus he did to all the cities of the sons of Ammon. Bob Waldron actually changed his view on this, because I have his commentary on 1 and 2 Samuel. It's like that thick. And in the workbook, he says that he thinks David just put them to slave labor with Saul's, but then he changes his view because in the commentary, which he wrote later, because 1 Chronicles 20, verse 3 says he cut them with the saws and all of that. So I don't think the point was that he was torturing them or giving them slow deaths or something like that, but he just used those instruments to kill them and even burned them in that kiln. So it seems a little harsh, but you got to remember he's carrying out the punishment of God on these Ammonites for being a constant thorn. All the way back in the Judges' time, ever since they've been in Canaan, Ammonites have been giving them problems, and God punishes them for that. Oh man, there's not enough time for class sometimes. A few applications here. Assume the best in people, right? If Hanun had not questioned the motives of David's servants, this would have never happened to them. Also, have Joab's attitude in spiritual warfare with your brethren. You say, look, if things get too hard for you, I'm going to come help you. If things get too hard for me in this spiritual warfare, you come help me. That's what we're here for. And I do see some messianic undertones in this chapter too. Jesus, like David, sends out his servants to share his loving kindness with the world. Yet we are rejected and persecuted and humiliated. Our motives are questioned by people who stubbornly refuse to submit to the king. And as a result, Jesus will take vengeance on his enemies in the end. Go ahead and read through page 80. I'm already past time. Nobody rung the bell, but if somebody could just hop up. Adam, maybe just hit that bell. I'm way past time. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.